we go. Okay, welcome everyone to our workshop this year on Megillah Esther, on the Megillah of Esther. And I think this is really an opportunity for us to look at the Megillah in possibly a new way. Someone already told me today that the common epitaph for the Megillah is to use that language in a derogatory sense. That is, oh, let's not make a whole Megillah out of it. You know, so the sort of sense that the Megillah is just this very long document and possibly doesn't have that much for us to learn from. That was one comment I had recently. Another comment I had recently was around the fact that this year, Purim is going to be very, very different. Even were the shul to be open for an in-person Megillah reading, that would still be with masks, social distancing, no children, no sweets, no drink. It would be a very different Megillah. And someone said to me, well, you know, what's the point in opening the shul up anyway? Purim's all about the kids. And at that point, I also thought, well, is that true? So on the one hand, the Megillah is just a long document which doesn't have much to share. On the other hand, maybe it's just a children's story, which again is not something we can necessarily eke out meaning from. What I'd like to do today is to sort of bring us back into the chasing lullabies aegis, which is the idea that sometimes we've been so used to stories and so used to texts. We're so used to the Megillah that we cease to ask questions about it. We no longer investigate it and think about it. Instead, we just sort of go with the flow. We all know this story. We've been dressing up as Mordechai or as Esther, if you're my little daughter. You know, like we've been dressing up as these things from a children's age. We've been talking about these heroes and these villains, the wicked Haman and the mean Akhashverish. We've been talking about them for such a long time that maybe we've ceased to ask basic questions about the Megillah. And when we do ask these questions, it could be that we can open up a whole new dimension to understand the narrative and understand the story. And maybe in the final stage, gain some new insights into what Purim is all about. So that's the plan for this evening. It's going to be a bit interactive. So please feel free to unmute yourselves with questions or comments, and I'll also pause for reflection together. I'm hoping that the session is going to be about an hour long, and it's being recorded for anyone who wants to catch up at a later point. So I want to begin by 3 basic questions about the text itself. If you want to have a Megillah in front of you, that's fine. But I actually think that for tonight, because so many people know the story so well, it's not always necessary to have the Megillah in front of us. Essentially, can we say that the Megillah is not just a Megillah? Can we say the Megillah is not just for kids, but maybe there's something new as adults that we can learn and make Purim more meaningful as a result to us? So some of the obvious questions. We're going to read the story and we're just going to pause at strategic moments just to think. Let's begin through looking at the Megillah through 3 different lenses. We're going to look at the Megillah through the lens of Queen Esther. We're going to look at the Megillah through the lens of Akhashverish, the king, and we're going to look at the Megillah through the lens of Haman, our evil villain. Let's start with Esther, our heroine. Now, she seems to be the person that saves the day, but actually, there's some strange aspects of what she does. By the way, one other thing is that the material for tonight comes from Rabbi David Foreman, who wrote a book called The Queen You Thought You Knew, which is a book about Megillah Esther. And this is coming from one of the presentations that he gave about that book, about the material he has in that book. He's got a whole book expanding the Megillah and really opening it up in very, very beautiful detail. We're taking one aspect of his thesis about the Megillah, and we'll be talking about that tonight. So all credit to him, and just a bit of my own personal spin, I'm sure, as well. So let's look at Esther. So we know that she has won the beauty contest and that she's become the queen of Persia. Of 127 provinces, she is the queen, following the rather difficult demise of the last post holder of the incumbent. And we fast forward, though, to the point that Haman has issued his decree, his genocidal decree, to destroy, to wipe off the face of the earth men, all Jewish men, women, and children. And the Jews are in mourning. They're in despair. Everything seems lost. Everyone is going to die. You know, like the final solution, the Wannsee conference has been held and it's been decreed, and there doesn't seem to be any hope at all. But until now, Esther has succeeded in holding on to a secret. It's a secret that she held at the encouragement of her maybe uncle, maybe husband, Mordechai. That he's told her, just don't reveal your birthplace. Don't reveal your Jewish identity. She's maintained that secret. The king does not know that she is Jewish. And at this point, that Haman has issued his genocidal decree, Mordechai implores her to reveal this. He says, please do tell her, go to the king, beseech the people, beseech the king to save the people, beseech the king to save the Jews. And initially, Esther refuses. Why? Because it turns out the king has sequestered himself for a while in his private chamber. And that's quite inconvenient because according to the law of the land, anyone who enters the king's chamber without a prior invitation takes their life in their own hands. Right? If the king holds his scepter out, so then you can come in. But if not, then the king is off with your head, essentially. So there is a very real risk to Esther's life, that if she goes in to opportune the king to release, to nullify the genocidal decree, that maybe she's going to lose her life. And it's actually been a month now since the king has called her in, and she's worried that she's lost favor with him. And Esther shares those misgivings and concerns with Mordechai, but he insists that Esther has to go to the king nevertheless. And so she agrees. She agrees to take the risk and to risk it all. She tells Mordechai and her entourage that she's going to undertake a prolonged 3-day fast. And after that, she'll face the king come what may. And so the moment of truth comes about. Esther dresses herself up in her beautiful clothes and she dares to enter the king's chamber. He sees her, even though she's unannounced. And amazingly, he lifts his scepter rather than holding it down. So he lifts his scepter, indicating permission for her to enter. She has managed to overcome that initial test, and she has now come in. As she approaches, he tells her the magic words. He says, I'm going to give you I'm going to give you your request. I'm going to give you whatever you want. Even up to half of my kingdom, it's all yours. What do you need? I'll give you half of my kingdom, my dear wife. My beloved Esther, I'm so happy to see you. And now stop right there. If you're Esther, what do you say right now? How do you play the game? What do you say? I'll give you half of my kingdom, says the king. What do you say? Unmute yourself if you want. Hold down the space bar, press the unmute button. What do you say?
Thank you very much.
And what do you ask for? What do you request?
Well, knowing the story, if I didn't know the story, I would say, please save my people. But
that's right. If you didn't know the story, you would say that if the king has let you in, your people are at risk of experiencing genocide, and the king has just said, I will give you anything, up to half of my kingdom, just ask for it. I'd ask for it. I would say, please, my people are about to be destroyed. Thank you for the kind offer. I will take up that kind offer, save the Jews. And now the decree.
But the only thing is, he doesn't know that she's Jewish because she's been told by Mordechai not to reveal her Jewish identity.
So Angela, you're already feeling something out. You're feeling out there may be a reason that she doesn't full on offer up that request. She doesn't reveal something. This could have been the opportunity for the big reveal, but she doesn't take it. Instead, she asks for something else. But, you know, so Angela, you're already starting to feel out maybe there's a reason that she doesn't do what we might have thought was obvious. Just say to your husband, listen, hubby, listen, dear king, Akhashverish, my love, you know, it's been so nice being with you. I forgot to tell you that I happen to be Jewish. And I just want you to know that it would be really important to me that the rest of my people don't get destroyed. Like, it's not so nice. So if you don't mind, you know, you offered me half the kingdom, I'll pass on half the kingdom, just don't kill the Jews. The truth is, she might not even have to tell him that she's Jewish. Why not just say, don't kill the Jews? She could just make a point. She doesn't have to say, there's an intense moral dilemma, king. I think it is wrong to commit genocide. I just don't think it's appropriate. Please, I don't want us to kill anybody unnecessarily, just save the Jews. She doesn't have to disclose anything about her own identity in order to do that. Again, we're used to the idea that she does have the big reveal later on. Why not stay in happy sort of secrecy about her own national identity and just say this is something which is unjust. I'm the queen of Persia. I can't sit by while we commit genocide.
She's being very subtle and playing a long game because she wants to do it gradually. She probably knows what he's like, doesn't want to shock him too much too quickly, and lead gradually to her request by asking for another audience and a party, and to actually show up Haman for what he's like.
So I want to take that thought, Rina, I want to expand it further, which is essentially, what is it that she knows about Akhashverish that would make it risky right now to ask simply...
His treatment of Vashti.
Right, so that's one thing. We'll get there in a second, what his treatment of Vashti. But the other one is his treatment of the Jews. Like, he doesn't seem to have any qualms with genocide, seeing as he flippantly and casually allowed Haman just to take his signet and to issue the decree, just to opportune the king for some sort of moral dilemma that the queen is facing. You know, he's going to brush her off. He doesn't seem to be a very morally based individual. So we'll see that actually Esther has a plan, but at first glance it seems strange. The king offers her anything that she asks for, and what does she ask for? She doesn't ask for freedom of the Jews. She doesn't ask to annul the decree. She asks for a party. Please, would you and Haman come and join me for a party? I've just been dying. I've actually put my life on the line to ask you to a party. Okay, so what's going on there? That's question one. Okay, question two. That's the question with Esther. Let's now see another question from a different perspective, a question from the perspective of Haman. Okay, so here we are, and Haman has decided to wipe out the Jews once and for all on a single blood-soaked day. So in order to do that, though, he needs the consent of the king, right? He's just the vizier. He's Jafar, the grand vizier. It's still, you know, Jafar only has so much power. The sultan, the king, needs to give that power to Haman. So let's just take a minute to contemplate what claim, if you were Haman, would you have made in order to encourage the king to allow you to kill the Jews? What statements would you have made about these Jews to suggest that they should?
Well, something along the line that maybe the Jews were threatening either the king or the kingdom.
So something about the Jews having a
royal as a threat, a personal threat to the king or the kingdom.
Some conspiracy theory about the Jews. Yeah, okay. Anything else?
Yes, they're taking over the kingdom. They're rebelling. They're taking all the riches. The sort of thing that Hitler would say. I'd say.
Right. There's plenty of anti-Semitic tropes that you can rely on if you need them. They're secretly running the banks, and actually they're the ones who are behind your succession to the throne, and if there's anything, they could actually undermine your entire enterprise, king, because they've got their hands in this and that. And actually, these Jews, they really like the blood of Persian children for their matzahs. Like every Pesach, they go along and they just take these little children and it makes the best matzah, Persian baby boy, children, whatever, matzah. But there's so many different things you could have said to incite hatred, to incite an irrational jealousy. There's a conspiracy against you, but let's look what he says. He actually says three things, two of them which seem entirely beside the point. One, the Jews are scattered throughout the Persian Empire. They don't have a single home. They don't have a nation state. We know that because just a few generations ago, they were exiled from their land and they're scattered therefore throughout the empire. That's one claim. Two, they observe their own laws, making them different from other nations. You know, they got this thing called the Sabbath. They got this thing called the laws of Jewish dietary laws called kosher. You know, they've got these different laws. And three, they don't keep the king's laws. Now, we wouldn't, when we were sort of thinking about what we would say as a claim, why we should encourage the king to support genocide, we never thought that Jews being scattered throughout the land would be a problem. We never thought that keeping their own ritual laws was a problem either. Now, not keeping the king's laws, that's a thing. Insurrection, fifth column, that sort of thing, you know, Nigel Farage sort of approach. That's fair enough. That's a good claim. But why the first two? If Haman's really into creating hatred, there's many more tropes that he could have brought about to encourage the idea that the Jews are problematic. Essentially, Haman is saying that the Jews are criminals. They don't keep the king's laws. And it's logical to argue that the Jews are criminals because that's what it means, not to keep the laws of the realm. So the third argument is really only the thing you get that would certainly encourage a person to do away with them. But the fact that they're scattered, there's no like zoning rules around the Jews. They live both in India and in Ethiopia. Is that grounds to do away with an entire nation? Similarly, the fact that they have their own rituals, well, I'm sure every single one of the 127 provinces, every culture had its own way of doing things. Again, why is that a reason to get rid of them? However, presumably Haman's not really being foolish. He actually has a plan. He knows the king well. And so the charges that he's making against the Jews is going to only be to his advantage to perpetuate his plan, to propagate his plan that to destroy the Jews. So we need to work out what he knew about the king that we don't. So first question is Esther. What did she know that we don't? And that's why she didn't ask straight away. What does Haman know that we don't? And that's why he asked these three different things. And the final person to turn to, and the final person to ask questions about is the king himself, King Akhashverish. So if you read the first 12 verses or so of the Megillah, we're going to read all about the glory and grandeur of King Akhashverish. We hear that the king, he was the emperor of the whole world, sovereign over 127 provinces, stretching all the way from India to Ethiopia. We read about his lavish 180-day-long party, the riches, the linens, the gold, the utensils. We read all about the unbelievable majesty of the Persian court. What's the one issue? Well, we're not reading the archives of the Persian court, we're reading the Megillah, a Jewish book. Why does a Jewish book need to discuss the splendor of Persia? Why start a book of the Bible with such an extended digression? And then let's talk about the king himself. Many readers of the Megillah, we sort of think about Akhashverish as sort of this naive, foolish guy. And maybe that's because of what he does in the first part of the Megillah. Actually, we have a cartoon which we will be playing alongside the Megillah this year. I just want to arrange it, which is that every different verse of the Megillah is a different slide. So you've got the verse at the bottom, you've got sort of a cartoon going along, acting out the Megillah. And Akhashverish there is portrayed as this like rather portly fellow, you know, a bit sort of drunk and not very thoughtful, a little bit like the Sultan in Aladdin, right? This sort of bumbling buffoon. And we sort of think about him like that, maybe because of what he does in the first part of the Megillah, where he asks his wife to do something quite strange. He asks at the end of this 180-day feast, he orders Vashti to be brought in front of the throngs and the multitudes. And here we are in chapter 1, verse 11. He asks to have Vashti the queen brought before the king to show off her beauty to the nations and princes, for indeed she was very beautiful. The question is, what's the king thinking here? It's crazy what he's doing, putting his wife on display, inviting other men to marvel at her. It's just not nice. It's just not very British. It's embarrassing. It's embarrassing not just for the poor woman at the center of attention. It's embarrassing to everybody else to be looking at someone else's wife and the queen. It's not a royal, refined thing to do. It's not sort of befitting the gravitas of his position. So why does Akhashverish do that? Why does the king do that? You could say he just wasn't a very refined person. Maybe he was drunk and just some sort of lapse at the end of this 180-day party. But maybe there's something else. There's a method to his madness. Maybe there was a reason that Akhashverish wanted to display his wife in this form. And it wasn't an irrational attempt at all. And so we have so far stacked up 3 questions. From Esther's point of view, why does she not ask for the freedom of her people when Akhashverish says you can have anything you want? Why does Haman suggest that the Jewish people, the reason to get rid of them is because they're scattered and they have their own laws, and not just because they're fifth column insurrectionists? And finally, why does Akhashverish why do we hear about Akhashverish's splendor and the splendor of Persia, culminating in this attempt to sort of really in an embarrassing way show off his wife to everybody, to all and sundry? I think when we answer this, we're going to learn new depths and meanings to the Megillah and really sort of see the personality and strategy and thinking and feeling behind these different characters, and hopefully understand Purim in a deeper way. So let's go back to our question we asked at the beginning, which was about Esther and her audience with the king. She is received warmly, and she's offered anything that she wants. So why doesn't she simply make the following argument? And this is where we started to discuss this before. Let's just play out different scenarios. What could she say? First thing she could say, without revealing her own Jewish status, is to say this: there's a moral travesty happening. Genocide. Why should we perform genocide? Now, what are the chances that that will succeed? And we already suggested that's not going to be very helpful, because we see the king doesn't seem to be so bothered about genocide. Like at the moment, there's the chief rabbi recently put out his distress about the massacre of the Muslims in the Far East. And currently we're being lobbied and being asked, we're lobbying government to make sure that their genocidal clause, there's a clause within the genocide motion that's going through Parliament to include a concern and a statement about what's going on at the hands of that regime. So why not just say that this is entirely immoral? So we say that the king doesn't seem to mind, because he was so flippantly happy for Haman just to take his signet ring and sign away the entire nation of the Jews. He's like, don't bother me, I'm just late for lunch. He doesn't seem to have a moral framework that could be triggered by Esther saying there's a moral travesty. So if she can't ask the king to save the Jews on moral or objective grounds, maybe she can ask maybe she can ask the king to save them on subjective grounds, because the king loves her. She is his bride, and you can see that he loves her because he's welcomed her into that chamber even though she wasn't invited. So maybe just ask to save the Jews for her sake, because it would be doing a favor to her. So not from the objective moral perspective, but from the subjective, do it for me, darling. Just do it for me. What would be wrong with Esther saying, just do it for me, darling? Well, if the king is apathetic about genocide and morality, he's apathetic about the Jews, there's one thing he's not apathetic about. There's one thing that Megillah tells us he's flaming mad about, and that is when Vashti refuses to be put on display. Well, that's the end of Vashti. And Esther knows about that history. She knows about how she came to be queen in the palace of Akhashverish. So She understands that there might be limits to what she can ask of him. So why would Vashti's demise have anything to do with a pause for Esther to ask the king to help her out? Well, let's go back and think about why the king would ask Vashti to display herself so publicly at the culmination of the party. It really goes back to the very first verse of the Megillah. The first verse of the entire Megillah reads, it happened in the days of Akhashverish. He was the Akhashverish who ruled from India to Ethiopia. The Megillah says over 127 provinces. Why is that introduction so important? Because it gives us a historical context. Put yourself in the king's shoes. It's the year 400 BC or so, BCE. For centuries, the dominant empire had been that of the Babylonians, but your people, the Persians, they swept in and defeated the dominant empire that has been in sway for so long in a lightning strike. And now the Persians become the largest empire the world has ever seen. And now you've got 127 provinces under you. What's your number one problem right now? Your number one problem right now is keeping the entire empire together. There's no internet, there's no trains, there's no telephones, there's no ability for mass communication or immediate communication. You've got this huge global empire. How are you going to keep everyone together? How are you going to pull all those pieces, those disparate parts, that multiculturalism, those different identities? How are you going to keep them bound together under the aegis of the grand empire of Persia? Well, if the first verse of the Megillah sets forth Akhashverish's problem, the next verse provides its answer, his answer and his response. Parties. As the Megillah says, in the first year of his reign, the king made this huge feast for all of his noblemen, all of his princes, the entire armies of Persia and Media. There were officers of the king there. He was showing off the riches of his glorious kingdom, the honor of his excellent majesty, many days, 180 days long. That's what his party was. If you want to rule, you can either rule by fear or you can rule through love. To try and whip all the different provinces into allegiance to Shushan, it's a difficult task. But to win the hearts and minds of all the different noblemen, middle management, officers of the different realms, all you have to do is get them to love you, to admire you. And so you throw a party and you show off the wealth and riches of Persia. The tapestries, the linens, the fine gold, and the wine flowing everywhere. Now you believe in the grand idea of the glorious Persian Empire. And as this feast draws to a close, it's almost been a half year of feasting. So he sends for Vashti and he asks her to wear one piece of clothing. He asks her to wear the royal crown. And who does he ask to go and get her? He asks his 7 closest advisors to go and bring in the queen to display her beauty before the nations and princes. So what's Akhashverish doing here? Well, let's reflect for a moment. What does it mean to be a king? Certainly a king is the main executive power of a country. In a monarchy, the king's word rules supreme. The king is law. But in a monarchy, a king is more than just the law. A king represents the nation. You know, in Shakespeare, kings are simply referred to by the name of their country. There's Norway, there's Denmark. They are simply referred to by their country because they embody their country. They embody the identity of the country. Why is the Queen's last name Windsor? You know, I cycled to Windsor Castle last week. That was half term, so had to have some half term myself. So I cycled to Windsor Castle. Her name is Windsor. Why is her name Windsor? Because she embodies Windsor. She is Windsor for us. And that is what a king does. A king is the male embodiment of the power and potency of the country. So what is a queen? Well, a queen is the feminine symbol to complement the male dominance, is the female beauty, the grace and beauty of the country is the queen. And so what does Akhashverish ask his wife to do? He asks the queen, the embodiment of the beauty of the country, to wear a crown and be shown off in front of all the noblemen. He is he's asking them to behold the embodied beauty of Persia. Yes, it's an objectification of his wife, and yes, it's a bit crass. But at the end of the day, when we could look at Vashti, and everyone will, in pride, say, isn't this a beautiful empire? But Vashti refuses to come. And for her unwillingness to embody this vision of Persia, she forfeits her crown and her life. As an aside, I believe there's a medrash which says that Vashti was the last vestige of the Babylonian Empire that came before. That really she was the rightful, so to speak, queen, in the sense that she was from the Babylonians, and Akhashverish, as the Persian general, married into royalty. So in actual fact, there was something even greater in her defiance of the king. He's asking her to embody Mother Persia, and she is saying, no, I'm still tied back to the old empire. And so she is refusing to make this political statement. This political, even though it's something which is done in a sort of crude manner, it's a political statement too. And so she loses her right to be queen. So what does the king do now? He begins a national search for the girl fit to be his new bride. And it really is an equal opportunity beauty contest. He's not looking for any sort of provincial princess. Anyone who wants to be queen could be queen. And this sort of fits in to the grand idea of unification, that anyone could be queen because anyone can represent everyone else. And in the end, Esther is the king's pick. Why Esther? We don't really know. The only information we do know is that that Esther found favor in the king's eyes. But the text tells us one other important detail, that, as we mentioned before, Esther's mentor, Mordechai, had told Esther, don't reveal that you're a Jew. So let's just think about how that would have worked out. Let's just wonder the conversation between Esther and Akhashverish when they meet on that fateful night. They're having small talk maybe, and Akhashverish says, oh, where are you from? And Esther sort of giggles and doesn't say anything. And sort of Akhashverish says, no, seriously, where are you from? You've got this really strange accent. It sounds Yiddish almost. And there's no Yiddish. So, but how does Esther get away with not revealing her family, not revealing her birthplace, not revealing her national identity? Maybe it's because the king was looking for someone who would effortlessly slip into the role of Mother Persia, to become the feminine symbol of his new empire. And so Esther's very refusal to talk about where she comes from sort of fits into that fantasy of the king, because she could be anything he wanted her to be. So forgive my misspent youth, but I used to watch lots of romantic comedies with my mum when I was a lad. And one of our, I know, right, Vanna, it's cute. And one of our favorite romantic comedies was Pretty Woman. So in Pretty Woman, Julia Roberts and what's it called, Richard Gere have their Gere. So they have their first conversation, and Richard Gere asks Julia Roberts' character, he says, what's your name? And she responds, what do you want it to be? It's like, I can fulfill any fantasy you want. And that's exactly what Esther seems to be performing for the king. She is fulfilling the fantasy that she can be anybody. She could come from any of these provinces, any of these countries. And therefore she can serve as Mother Persia. And then Mordechai comes to Esther with a heart-stopping request. Tell the king that you're a Jew. You have to do this. Beg him to save your people's lives. And so now Esther goes into Akhashverish, and he tells her that she can ask for anything she wants, even half the kingdom. But Esther hesitates. Why does she hesitate? Why doesn't she just say, save my people? Not from a moral perspective, but from a personal perspective. King, you love me, so save my people. But now we know why she hesitates, because maybe the love that the king had for her was conditional on one thing, that she is not tied into a particular national identity, but rather she holds the role of Mother Persia. She is pan-Persia, pan-nationalism, one particular face of this empire. She is all faces of this empire. Because what happened when Vashti refused to offer herself up as Mother Persia? That was the end of Vashti. What might happen if Esther says, you know, this game that I was playing, trying to be Mother Persia, well, actually, you know, I'm a Jew. So then the king says, well, now, one second, where does your loyalty lie? Is it with Persia or is it with them? Whose queen are you anyway, Esther? Ours or theirs? Whilst Mordecai made clear to Esther that silence is not an option, what can she possibly do without putting her life entirely on the line, her very relationship with the king on the line? So let's dig a little bit further to see what Esther does do and why her response is so masterful. So Esther says, if it's good for the king, let the king and Haman come today to a party that I have made for him. What will be the correct grammatical form here? If it's good for the king, let the king and Haman come to a party that I've made for him. What should it say instead? It should say for them. Right. There's two people here. There's the king and there's Haman. I've made a party for you, for the two of you, not just for one of you. What does she mean here? There are only two possibilities, really. And if you are Akhashverish, well, neither of these possibilities is that appealing. So possibility one is that Esther is making the banquet for her king, for her husband, for Akhashverish. Well, if that's the case, that she wants to have a private dinner party, a date with her husband, so why is she inviting Haman to interrupt their date? Why is she bringing a third wheel? The other option is even worse. The other possibility is that she's made the party just for Haman. But why is she making a party for him? Things get even worse because at that first party, the king asks Esther again, what's your request? What do you want? Up to half of my kingdom, I'll give you. I'll give you up to half of the kingdom. And what's Esther's response? My request, my petition, here's what it is. If I found favor in the eyes of the king, if it pleases the king to grant my petition to perform my request, then another party. Let the king and Haman come to another banquet that I'll make for them. And I'll do tomorrow as the king has said. So now whoever the banquet was for the first time, that was one person. Now it's for them. Now it's for both of them, the king and Haman. What exactly does Esther think she's doing here? And so Rashi dings in at this point, and he suggests that Esther is doing something highly dangerous. She's actually insinuating that there might be some sort of illicit dalliance between her and Haman. She's planting the seed of an exceptionally dangerous idea. Maybe she's lacking infidelity, and she's hinting to the king that she's having an affair with the Grand Vizier. Why is she doing that? Leave that question for a second, but let's now think about it from the king's perspective. What's going on in his head? He's thinking, who is this banquet for? It's one of us, me or Haman, and either possibility is bad because now we've got the other person here. Either she's sleeping with him or she's not, but she's including him for some strange reason that is affecting our relationship. There's just too much ambiguity here. You know, this woman is playing games with me. Why? And so all of a sudden his imagination gets the better of himself. And he starts to doubt whether she loves him. She starts to doubt not whether she's Mother Persia, but whether she's my wife. It's no wonder the king can't sleep that night. It's no wonder the king can't sleep that night. And as it turns out, the king is not the only one who can't sleep that night. Haman had also been unable to sleep. He's preoccupied with killing Mordechai, so preoccupied that he has to take himself out for a walk to the palace. So whilst Haman is preoccupied with Mordechai, the king is preoccupied with Haman. Why is the queen inviting Haman to all these banquets? And as the king lies awake, he asks for the royal book of records to be read to him. And lo and behold, they open a page to reveal a surprise. Long ago, there was this plot between Bigtan and Teresh that Mordechai foiled. They were planning to assassinate the king, and Mordechai saved the king from this assassination attempt. It was the Guy Fawkes that never happened, right? And it turns out that this man, Mordechai, was never awarded for his loyalty to the king. So the king is thinking about how to offer a reward to this person, and he asks, who's that out there in the courtyard? It's Haman, the person I've been preoccupied with that led me to read this. And now Haman is called in. Haman, remember, who's thinking about killing Mordechai. And the king asks Haman, what should be done with a man that the king wants to honor? Now, if the question catches Haman off guard, he doesn't show it. And Haman says to himself, to whom would the king want to bestow greatness and honor more than me? And so Haman says to the king, well, to the Melech Hafetz Bikoro, the person who the king wants to honor, let them bring royal clothes that the king has worn, and a horse that the king has ridden upon, and a crown the king has worn on his head, and let the clothes and the horse be presented to him by one of the king's high ministers, and let them dress the man the king wants to honor in the clothes, and let them parade him through the streets on the horse, and let them call before him, this shall be done to the man that the king wishes to honor. And if you're in the king's shoes, what do you think of what Haman has just said? Over to you. What do you think about this statement that Haman has just said?
That Haman sees himself as the role of king.
Insurrection! How many times has the word king just played out? Take the king's horse and the king's clothes and the king's... And Haman thinks it's about him. King, 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 make me king. Haman's plans and plot to become... to take power is starting to seep out. And it's like now the suspicion that Esther planted is augmented. Not only does he want to take my wife, he wants to take my crown. Now, things don't go so well for Haman at this point, because the king responds in quite the opposite way that Haman would have wanted. Quickly, take the horse and the clothes and do everything you said for Mordechai, the Jew. Don't withhold any of the things you've just spoken about. So that's what happens. Haman leads Mordechai through the streets, whereby Haman is now giving Mordechai the honor that he wanted for himself. He's now giving it to his mortal enemy. Now, from Akhashverish's perspective, it's not such a bad thing for Haman's egotistic balloon to get deflated a little bit. And all this happens in the space between banquet number 1 and banquet number 2. And so quite a lot has changed in the minds of our protagonists. By the time banquet number 2 rolls around, Haman, all but invincible the day before, is now vulnerable. There's now a suspicion in the king's mind. Maybe he wants my wife. Maybe he wants my crown. As the table is set and the wine is poured for the second banquet, it's up to Esther to seize the moment. But let's shift to Esther's perspective. She's got to seize this moment without getting herself killed in the process. Esther is facing 2 liabilities herself. The first is the Mother Persia liability. If she reveals her nationality and loyalty to the Jews, she possibly risks being seen by the king as a charlatan, as someone who's not fulfilling his fantasy of the pan-Persian empire, and possibly falls foul of the fate of Vashti. Second, she's also planted a liability about her own fidelity. Does she really love him? Has she been loyal to him? And so these two liabilities, she has to battle perhaps even more than Haman himself. Haman is trying to destroy the Jews, but Mother Persia and the loyal wife are coming to destroy Esther. But as overwhelming as these liabilities might seem, Esther is not doomed to succumb to them. And so here, Rabbi Foreman uses an analogy of martial arts. I used to do karate as a kid. My father actually was a black belt, and so he was very interested in us taking on his passions. I did it for a while, but then stopped. And one of the things that happens in martial arts is that you're very rarely encouraged to use your strength directly against someone else, because who knows who's the stronger person? It could be your opponent is the stronger person. Instead, martial arts encourages the fighter to use the other person's strength against them, to use their momentum, to use their force in a way that will weaken them. So, for example, a blow is struck towards you. Rather than getting in the way and trying to directly block the blow, who knows if you're strong enough to block it? Rather, deflect the blow, and in so doing, cause your opponent to just come off balance by a tiny bit, because they were expecting to hit something solid, and you've deflected their blow away. Now they're slightly off balance. Whilst they're off balance, you can use their forward momentum against them and lose them and cause them to fall onto the floor. And so here we have to see Esther being a martial artist. All she has to do essentially to avoid getting destroyed by the liabilities she faces, by the problem of Mother Persia and the problem of the infidelous wife, is to somehow get out of the way of those trains which are hurtling towards her and allow them to do their work in the arena between the king and Haman. And so let's see how Esther can use those liabilities to her advantage. Can she martial arts her way out of this situation? So we go back to the scene of this, all these different tensions being played out, the second banquet. And again, Akhashverish asks Esther to make a request. And this time, Esther tells her husband what's on her mind. If I find favor in your eyes, O king, and if it's good in your eyes, then give tinasan li nafshi b'shelasi v'ami b'kashasi. Give me my life as my request, and the life of my people as my petition, because me and my people have been sold to be destroyed, to be destroyed, killed, annihilated. We've had a genocidal decree against us. The king listens to this and he's shocked. He demands to know, who is it that would dare do such a thing, to destroy the life of his queen? Ish, Tsar, V'oyev, Haman Arasha, a man who's a treacherous enemy, Haman, the evil one. That's who it is. And so here it is. Esther finally reveals that her people, the Jews, are endangered, and she brings to light the identity of the aggressor, which is Haman. So let's go back and examine this more carefully. How did Esther deal with her two liabilities? A first clue comes from the fact that Esther has not simply asked the king to spare her nation. She's not simply said, save the Jews. She's asked him to save her own life. Now, my life and my request. Not only that, but she mentions her own life first, and then va'ami b'vakashasi, and then she says, my people with my petition. First, save me, then save my people. So you see, the news that someone is out to get his queen, the news that Esther's life is threatened, makes everything else pale into insignificance. It's like the king doesn't hear anything else. Once he hears that he might lose his wife, his beloved Esther, then he asks, who is it that wants to destroy you, that wants to take you away? And Esther's only happy to share her answer. It's Haman. He's right here with you. The announcement of her national affiliation seems to be drowned out by the bigger headline, right? It's like the big headline is, someone's out to kill your wife. In the small detail, Esther reveals she's a Jew, right? But the big headline is, someone's out to get my wife. It's personal. It's not just someone's out to kill the queen. Someone's out to take my wife away. So the first step for Esther in softening the threat to her mother Persia image is to distract Akhashverish from that sort of inconvenient reality about my own national affiliation, and instead to play the damsel in distress. The woman you love is going to be put to death. Be the knight in shining armor. Who wouldn't? What sort of man wouldn't rise to the occasion? By the way, lost in the drama of that moment, perhaps the melodrama of that moment, is an inconvenient little fact. Esther's sort of put a little white lie into the equation, because it's not really true that Esther's life is on the line. No one even knew that she was a Jew. She could have blissfully settled her time away watching the genocide happen, and no one would have known the better. So yes, of her own volition, she's by divulging her religion and national identity, it turns out that technically Haman's decree of genocide does also affect her, but she could have just said nothing, right? And even now that she's divulged her identity, is she really threatened? The king just issue her an exception. Esther's claim that she's at mortal danger, it's a pretty dubious claim, but of course Esther doesn't want the king to stop and think about the validity of that claim. She just wants him to act irrationally, passionately, getting rid of the decree that's causing all the trouble. Esther is trying to beckon Akhashverish to the hasty conclusion that if I'm threatened by a man, that she wants him to say, if I'm threatened by a man who would destroy me because of my national affiliation, why not just annul the decree that threatens me and kill the man who thought it all up? Then you'd have saved my life and be my knight in shining armor. The logic sort of works perfectly until you think a little bit more about it. Esther, though, takes things further too. She's not only tried to protect the revelation of her national identity, to protect the liability of Mother Persia, but she's trying to also share something else, martial arts fashion. How is she doing that? Well, remember about Esther's Mother Persia liability. She says that Esther is, in the king's eyes, Esther is the symbol of feminine Persia, the beauty of Persia. And Esther's identity is beyond any nationalism. So she's sort of making a case that by Haman trying to pick out one particular part of her identity, that Haman is doing something very Vashti-like. You know, it's not how we do things here in our empire to focus on one particular national identity as being inferior to the rest. We're all about the grand, unified Persia king. Haman's the one who can't see petty ethnic identities. Haman's the one who's into ethnic cleansing. You and me, we believe in the big king, father and mother Persia idea. Now, Mother Persia is no longer Esther's liability, it's an asset. Haman is now on the side of Vashti, while Esther is on the side of the king. But what about Esther's other liability? What about her insinuation of a dalliance, a romantic dalliance with Haman? How has she managed that one? Well, on the one hand, you could say, well, if someone's trying to kill you, you're probably not going to be having an affair with them. She could just be refuting it out of mind. But that wouldn't be so martial arts, would it? Maybe there's something else, something deeper that Esther is sort of doing to push that energy to work towards her. Well, let's think about that. When Esther insinuated that Haman was having an affair with her, what would that mean to the king? That would mean to the king that Haman is trying to take away my wife. And what has Esther confirmed in her revelation of Haman's genocidal desires? She's confirmed that Haman is trying to take away your wife. It's just not trying to take me away by seducing me. He's trying to take me away by killing me. But that's a fine detail. The energy of what Esther had already created, that train hurtling down the tracks saying, someone's out to take away your wife, well, that's still there. There's only one problem. The king, at this point, runs into the garden. Until this point, the king has impetuously dispatched every decision immediately without thought and deliberation. Now the king seems to run out to have a think. But what happens when the king comes back in? Now, there's all sorts of things, by the way, that Haman could have done at this point in time, and we don't actually have enough time to answer that right now. But Haman, theoretically, Haman could have still. It's not game over for Haman at this point. Haman could have said there was a good claim that Haman made about the Jews. What was the claim made about the Jews? They're scattered in their own throughout the lands. They have their own rules and rituals, and they're insurrectionists. Maybe what Haman was really saying was not three separate ideas, but one idea. It's just not worth having them in this empire, king. They are a nation which lack the apparatus of ordinary nations. Why? Ordinary, there's two things that define a nation: land and laws. They have their own land, and they have an independent set of laws that define their identity, their national identity. The Jews, paradoxically, have lost their land. They've been exiled just 2 generations before. They've been kicked out of Israel, but still they have their own laws. And they don't even keep the king's laws. These landless Jews, they just don't bow. It's really not worth having them as part of the empire. They're just a parasite. They are people that don't offer anything in terms of their own independent nationhood. They don't even have a land. They're scattered throughout the nation, but they're parasites. They try and keep themselves separate while still being here. Haman could still breathe life into that anti-Semitic claim, but there's one thing that he does that destroys any further traction he has at his disposal. What's that? The king runs back in from the garden, and at that point, Haman had fallen on the couch upon which Esther was seated. The king declares, "Would Hagam lechvosh hamaka whilst I'm in the house? Would you even conquer the queen while I'm yet here?" The Megillah says the words just fell out of the king's mouth, and then they covered Haman's face. The king, when he comes in and he sees Haman lying on Esther's couch, boldly and suddenly accuses Haman of adultery, of trying to seduce his wife whilst he's still there in the house. If you think about the words, they seem utterly preposterous. After everything Esther has told him, do you really think Haman is trying to seduce her? Hasn't Esther said she has no interest in this mortal enemy, that she despises him more than any other person? Why would Akhashverish think that Haman is trying to seduce her? Well, the text of the Megillah sort of nudges us in the direction of an answer. It says that the words just fell out. They slipped out of the king's mouth. It means this wasn't his conscious mind talking. It was his subconscious mind talking. For an entire day, the king had wondered whether Haman was romantically involved with his wife. He couldn't even sleep because of that anxiety that maybe he's losing his wife. Esther has actually suggested that Haman doesn't want to sleep with her, he wants to kill her. But when we said that the heart of that heart of that idea is the same, Haman wants to take my wife away. She hasn't disconfirmed those suspicions. She's just given a different guise for the same idea. Haman wants to take her away. And now Haman is lying on the couch. He's trying to take her away. In actual fact, the king uses a military term. He says, "Lichboish, you've come to conquer my wife." Why does he use a military term for marital infidelity? It's because this is not the workings of a rational mind, it's the workings of an irrational one. From Esther and Haman's perspective, Haman on the couch means nothing, but to the irrational, jealous husband, when the words just slipped out, Haman on the couch means everything. He's trying to conquer my queen, my wife, my kingdom. He wants the crown for himself. He's wanted it all along. He wanted my horse, my crown, my clothes. Now he wants my wife. He's trying to take everything away from me. And that's enough for Akhashverish, and it's off with Haman's head. And so we've come to answer our three questions. We've come to understand a little bit more about why Esther couldn't simply ask immediately for her needs, why Haman had this multi-pronged approach to reason as to why to get rid of the Jews, and why also Akhashverish is given this sense of his Persian grandeur. It sets the stage for a subtext to the Megillah that is really full of strategy, full of interwoven ideas. But there's one possibly heretical outcome from this reading, which is, if there was so much strategy going on, what about what we were all taught about the deep religious reasoning for the Purim story? We are taught from a young age, Purim is the festival of Esther Purim, of God's hidden face. Like Esther, Haster, Astir, I will surely hide my face. And Esther is the vehicle for God to be working in the background, for God to be directing all the different parts of this story. Now that we've come up with this grand strategic game between the different players, what room is there for God? Why is it even a religious festival? So whilst I can't claim to know the workings of God, I would like to just suggest something based on Rabbi Foreman. I think it's a beautiful idea. And with this, we'll conclude and then open up for questions and reflections. If we think that working with God is a zero-sum game, so then yes, we're right. What do I mean by a zero-sum game? In a race, like let's say you've got a cycle race, there's only one winner. If someone else is winning, then I'm losing, right? As a friend once said to me, coming second place means you're the best loser. So in a zero-sum game, this is a good friend, right? So in a zero-sum game, there's only one winner. And if anyone else is not the winner, they're the loser. Whereas when it comes to working with God, and sometimes, by the way, sometimes we think that working with God is also a zero-sum game. If I'm putting in my effort, then there's no need for God. If God's putting in effort, there's no need for my efforts. But that's probably not how it works. Maybe rather than thinking about working with God as either or, as either me or him, maybe it's more about a collaboration, that we can put in our efforts together, that in combination with God directing the scenes and me putting in as much effort as I can, we will come to a favorable outcome. We actually see that seems to be Esther's strategy too. Where do we see that? Well, she's going to go and meet her husband after a month of not being called. Now, if you were a chief strategist, you'd want to look as beautiful as you possibly could. Esther calls for a 3-day fast. She doesn't eat for 3 days. Now, I don't know about you, but if I don't eat for 3 days, I'm looking pretty grim. I'm not looking like my beautiful, perfect self and my husband. I'm actually not necessarily doing the best strategic move, but I might be doing the right religious move. Esther seems to know that if anything is going to work here, it needs to be a partnership between what I do down here to bring about the best outcome and my prayers upstairs to ask God to partner with me. And maybe that's the message of the Megillah. The Megillah is the last book of the Tanakh. It's the book that we finish off the canon of law. We started at the Garden of Eden, where man is given the ability to create. And we finish with Purim, where man is given the command or the instruction or the encouragement to co-create. We started off the first mitzvah in the Torah. We started off the Bible by saying, co-create with God. The first mitzvah, puruvru, have children. And then in every child, we know there are 3 parties, father, mother, and God. And in every enterprise, says the Megillah, there are multiple parties too. There's your human aspect, there's the efforts that you put in, and then there's your godly efforts as well. There's the efforts that God puts in. So the Megillah might give us a new and refined understanding of what it truly means to strive as a Jew. Not just to strive either him or me, but to partner with God together to co-create a better world. With those thoughts in mind, I wish you all a happy, happy Purim, co-creating a better story for tomorrow. Any thoughts or reflections, very welcome.
I like the conclusion, the working together. That doesn't mean I didn't like the rest of it, sorry.
That's all right. No, I didn't take it as that. That's fine. But no, it's a nice conclusion.
I like the image of Esther as this like chief.
Shoshana, I've lost you.
Oh,
No, what you said, you like this?
That's not what you want to say to your wife. I like seeing Esther as a tactician.
Right. Not just this helpless damsel who has to do things by her handler Mordecai, but rather someone who's really thinking it through at each stage. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And you and I, Shoshana, have spoken in the past that the tragedy of the Megillah is that when everything's said and done, Esther has to stay in the palace of Akhashverish. She's given her life up in terms of what she would have wanted. You know, she wanted to marry a nice Jewish boy, or maybe she was already married to a nice Jewish boy, depending on different commentaries, and live her life with the rest of her people. And yet she stays in the palace and stays as Akhashverish's wife. The one redeeming factor there, though, is that Akhashverish and Esther have a son, which means actually the next king of Persia is a Jew, and this king of Persia is called Darius, stepson's son. And he's the one that allows the Jews to go back and rebuild the temple. So maybe there's a small hope there for Esther as well. My friends, thank you very much for logging on this evening. I wish you all a very, very happy, healthy, joyous Purim. So looking forward to hopefully seeing some of you at a distance or on Zoom, and maybe only share more happy occasions and be really well.